We good? Our next speaker is Mylan Tootoosis. Mylan is someone that I really look up to and personally through time have learned a lot from. I'm proud to call Mylan a brother, and he's one of those young academic thinkers that is really grounded and rooted in community and family. And he puts the fear into many academics that are full of shit, because he's not. So Mylan Tootoosis is a Plains Cree Nakota from Poundmaker Indian Reserve and Treaty 6 territory. He is a tribal college alumni and earned his BA in Indigenous Liberal Studies from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He completed his Master's of Arts in Indigenous Governance at UVic and is currently a doctoral student in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. His research concentrates on decolonization and the political ecology of contemporary Indigenous prairie livelihood in Treaty 6 territory. You're about to have your mind blown. Please put your hands together for Brother Mylan Tootoosis.
Thanks, bro. Appreciate it. Awesome. Check. Thanks for the introduction, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And sometimes when I hear my bio, it holds me to account. And when I hear my introduction, it also holds me to account. And so with that being said, I want to deliver to you not only perspective from my experience as an Indigenous scholar, but as a decolonial thinker and an Indigenous person who lives on the prairie landscape. So I want to speak to the truth of that and root myself in this landscape as my people's traditional territory. And if you're coming from somewhere else, what was that? And if you're coming from somewhere else, I want to welcome you to my territory in a good way with an open heart. And I want to open your hearts and minds to the conversation that's currently taking place on the prairie landscape. My PowerPoint's up, please. Any moment? So my talk for today is Indigenous autonomy and Indigenous education, because I want to speak to this at this conference, because first and foremost, what I want to highlight is that Indigenous peoples are not supposed to be here today. That me as an Indigenous graduate student, I am not supposed to be here today. And that the processes of colonialism and colonization attempted to erase us from this landscape. However, they failed. And we are still here today. I also want to share a story with you. I love teachers. My heart goes out to the frontline workers working in the community. However, I had some run-ins with a few who I feel attempted to sabotage where I am today. And I still have run-ins with a few administrators and things like that who really don't want me to say what I'm going to be saying to you here today. But when I was in grade 9, I wrote an academic paper. Grade 8, grade 7, grade 9, I think Miss Pauls is in here. It wasn't you. I'm not talking about you. You were awesome. There's another teacher, a settler teacher. I wrote this amazing paper. My mom was doing her master's at the time, and I wrote it about aliens, of all things. And I was so pumped about this paper. I pulled an all-nighter, one of my first all-nighters in history, and I wrote this paper on aliens. I even cited it in APA because my mom was doing her master's in social work. So I went home and got the manual, and I worked on the laptop, or on the computer, and it was typed up, good to go. One had handed it in. I was waiting for my A. I was all pumped. I get called into the office 2 days later, and the teacher says, "Mylan, who wrote your paper for you?" And I was like, what do you mean? I wrote this paper. No, really, where'd you get this paper from? And I said, what are you trying to say? What's the problem here? And he said, I don't think you wrote this paper, and I think you cheated. Go home and bring your sources and let me look at them tomorrow. And I was gutted. I was punched in the gut. And as a result of that, I went home and I told my mom, I said, hey, this teacher thinks I didn't write my paper, thinks I cheated, and that somebody wrote it for me. I don't know who else would write a paper on aliens. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't my brother. Right? And she was mad. She went back to the school the next day and doing what Native moms do, grilled him. Right? Grilled him, really tied into him. And that really lingered with me all throughout high school to the point of where I almost even dropped out. I was tired of it, right? Because in my mind, I was already told at that young age that me as an indigenous student, I am not capable of writing. You're not supposed to be writing. You're not supposed to be this good at what you do, right? And as a result of that, for a lot of people from Giskigomamna, Palmaker Reserve here, that's one of the reasons I left Palmaker School, was to come to Saskatoon because I knew that I'd have run-ins with that teacher, and I already felt like the deck was rigged. So I came to Saskatoon and I graduated in high school from here. And so for me as a PhD student, speaking to you today, I've already had those barriers I had to overcome. So for you as teachers in the room, you're in a very sacred space. You have to be very mindful. You have to be emotionally intelligent to speak and work with indigenous youth. Because we live in a time where we're struggling to maintain who we are. I am not supposed to know who I am. And so I'm going to share with you today who I am, right? I'm Mylan Tootoosis from Palmaker Indian Reserve. I dance powwow. I'm an archer. Archery is my go-to. It's been my saving grace, right? This is my positionality, as we call it in indigenous academia. Prairie boy through and through. I love the prairie. It's my natural space. You come out there with me and I'll show you places. I'll show you how to live out there. It's my comfort zone, right? But I also want to take this time to contextualize even other systemic challenges in my PhD program, personal challenges, that we're not exempt from the ongoing struggles our people face. This is one of my greatest teachers, my mentor, my best friend in life, my late father, Mylan Tootoosis, who just passed away 3 years ago while I was doing my PhD program. One of my biggest supported me to get an education, supported me, helped me, encouraged me up all the way until his dying breath. I remember going to visit him in ICU at RUH and visiting with him and having conversations. And he would point to me and he'll tell me to go back to work on campus, right? Very challenging space to work in, especially when I'm working with indigenous students on campus who are being silenced. Because I view that space as also a sacred space where indigenous people are attempting to acquire and gain knowledge. And it's a personal space for me, because that campus is where my father took his last breaths in the physical world. So when I critique the institution, when I critique the academy, it's not coming from a place of disconnect. It's coming from a place of truth, of who we are as indigenous people and the challenges we have to overcome to get our education. And I wanted to position that this is my greatest teacher was my father, my late father. And some of you may recognize him. Where do I come from? This is Palmaker Hill. This is Giskigomamna area. This is the Palmaker Reserve, right? This is the hill where my house is located, looking down, looking east towards North Battleford. Our house would just be out of frame to your right. This is the hill me and my brother run up and down in the spring and summer for our fancy dance training, our war dance training. So I grew up here. This is the hill I played in. This is the hill where I played with my cars in. My hands touched this soil. This is the space where my feet first touched the earth. This is also the hill where in 1885, Colonel Otter came to destroy our people, to kill the people of Palmaker Indian Reserve. Right? A colonial history here. And so I grew up in the consciousness of what I say is true here, that we're not supposed to be here today. Right? And in 1885, our warriors pushed them back, defended our people. And I grew up in this consciousness of maintaining that need to defend who we are and where we come from. And I wanted to speak to that positionality because the colonial relationship is still ongoing today. That we're still attempted to be colonized and assimilated into the Canadian economy and into the Canadian politic. That they want to erase our inherent rights. Right? And we have to acknowledge that because, ironically, we are working in an education system that's trying to strive to resurge and embrace indigenous peoples and embrace our identity and histories. But at the same time, we're seeing systems currently in play that are oppressing us, oppressing and silencing our young people. Right? And we know these impacts. Disorientation from colonialism, still ongoing. Disempowerment. My story of disempowerment from the teacher who said I was a plagiarizer. I'm waiting for him to do his master's. I keep searching him on Google to see if he does his master's, because when he publishes his thesis, I'm going to tear it to shreds. Again, disempowerment, right? Disempowerment from colonization and colonialism, the attempt to disempower us. Discord, the chaos, the inability for our people to come together on the same page again, an impact of colonialism and colonization. Disease, an impact of colonialism and colonization. These impacts of colonization and colonialism have happened, and they're still being maintained by the colonial political and economic systems that are in play. The systems that we as indigenous people need to implement on our own terms. That we need to create in our own terms, in our own language, the systems that are trying to oppress us as a way of pushing back. And I'll speak about what I mean by that later on. Settler colonialism is ongoing. Colonization is ongoing. In settler colonial regimes, the irreducible element is territory. That indigenous peoples have a right to our lands and territories, and non-indigenous peoples are coming in, attempting to erase our presence from that landscape. Sure, it may not be taking place physically. Right? Sure, they're not kicking us in the butt off the reserve, but they're doing it legally and economically. They're doing it through provincialized education systems where they're erasing this history from the textbooks. Right? Settlers seek to make indigenous land their home and source of capital. Right? And this is for the academics in the room. This is Tuck and Yang. This is Patrick Wolf, who does work on settler colonialism, some of the academic background. Again, in the picture, this is Palmaker. This is the battle site. This is where we defended our people's right to live. So again, to erase our presence from this landscape is an ongoing project that we have to be mindful of. We have to be critical of. And it's still taking place today in various ways, where we're seeing the commodification of land and water, where there's an attempt to take control of the natural resources and exploit them for the benefit of the Canadian state. Right? And I'm contextualizing this. This is colonialism. Right? This is ongoing neocolonialism. Right? This is imperialism, where we're seeing colonization come in through capitalism, a certain flavor of economic development that's not sustainable, a certain flavor of sell the resources and ask questions later, a certain flavor of just say yes to Canada, right? That now we're going to bring you into the relationship. You've been on the margins for too long. I don't trust that relationship, and none of us should, especially educators in the room, because the reality is colonialism is still ongoing. Colonization is still ongoing. This is a picture that if you Google search Fort Balliford, they took it off their website for good reason, because there's no way this would survive today. If you Google search Fort Balliford, you'll come across this photo that highlights the romanticization of settler colonialism. That this point of view photo with these little settler children running with a red coat towards somebody doing a full-on charge is how settler colonialism is romanticized today. Who are they attacking in this photo? Us, right? These colonial projects are ongoing. And in some cases, they're conscious. In other cases, they're really unconscious. And we have to make them conscious. We have to make people aware of this system and this process playing out. Right? That this history is still taking place. That we're not supposed to be here. Right? So what now, right? We know colonialism's taking place. We hear it. I was teaching all morning to my first-year Indigenous Studies students, and they're frustrated because I keep sort of holding their feet to the coals. Settler colonialism, settler colonialism. Pierre Trudeau Jr., right? Just switching the words, same thing. And today they're like, well, what then? I know. What do we do? Right? And these are settler students from rural Saskatchewan, which is why I love teaching 107 Indigenous Studies, is because in the past 4 years, I tallied that I've interacted with almost 1,000 students from the rural Saskatchewan areas from my time as a PhD student at USask. And I've been developing them. I've been honing them at this first level course to be aware of things as they go into their second, third, and fourth year programs, which is why Indigenous Studies 107 is a really important program. And I encourage everybody to tell their young people to take it. So what now? Was that another clap? Yes. I want to propose to you Indigenous livelihood frameworks. My field I'm emerging into is called political ecology, where we look at multiple sectors that take place on a landscape and we measure their impacts. We measure what's taking place on a landscape, not just in the political sense, not just in the economic sense, but also in the social and environmental sense. So when we're looking at policy, we ask questions as political ecologists: how does this policy impact the environment? How does policy impact the social structures of a community? Right? And what I want to hit home to the educators in the room is that we need land-based ecological restoration projects in place, reclamation projects that are reasserting our ability to be political, that are reasserting our ability to be economic, that are reasserting our ability to socialize and maintain our own social structures, and our ability to gain access to the environment, all founded in our cosmology as Indigenous people. This is an Indigenous livelihood framework. When I look at this framework and certain political processes in play, all I am seeing is just the political. Very little relationship to social and environmental projects on the landscape. We need these decolonial projects. We need all classrooms to at least cater and facilitate the emergence of Indigenous autonomy and Indigenous nations. And that's your roles as Indigenous teachers. That's your role as teachers who are in that sacred space as an educator. And ask yourself the question, if you feel uncomfortable with that, if you feel uncomfortable with supporting the Indigenous autonomy of Indigenous students and youth, then what paradigm are you operating from? It's settler colonial paradigms. The paradigm of colonization. The master-slave dialectic, where these Indigenous people can't govern, they can't parent. I'm going to tell them how to do it. I'm going to show them how to do it. We need to erase that from the conversation. So the goal here as educators is Indigenous autonomy, because racism is taking place in rural Saskatchewan. Colonialism is taking place in rural Saskatchewan, and we have to be mindful of that. We have to gear up our children to interact and push back against these colonial narratives. And how we do that is by reasserting the truth of who we are as Indigenous people in Treaty 6 territory, engaging in peaceful and diplomatic relationships with settlers. Now ask yourself, does my education speak to this? Does my education foster this framework? Right? Because my greatest teachers, although I did have great teachers and professors, my greatest teachers were individuals and Indigenous people who did not exist in the classroom. They were the land-based practitioners. They were my late father and his teachers, his mentors. These narratives still exist, and we still have the option and the ability as Indigenous people to gain access to these narratives. This Indigenous livelihood framework should be embedded in all that we do as Indigenous people. And that's the steps to Indigenous nationhood. We should have a political project in play. We should have economic projects in play. I have a garden project emerging this summer with my nieces and nephews on Palmaker called the Green Renegades, where we're going to plant little gardens for them, and they're going to maintain it. And we're going to have conversations around the political role of this garden, the impact it has, the economic role of this garden, where we're striving for food sovereignty, where we don't have to buy food. Right? And they're amazed with this conversation because they're not hearing it in the schools. Right? The social structure, where I'm coming together with them as an uncle to foster them and get them to engage and interact with the landscape. And again, we're interacting with the environment. We're interacting with the land base. The cosmological relationship is in play, where we're saying prayers before we enter the garden, where before we plant, there's a prayer going out for a good harvest. Right? All our projects, all our livelihood projects had this in play traditionally. And we need to embed them in all our projects from here on in. And then you'll see the emergence of indigenous nations, because we will no longer be dependent on the colonial systems that tell us how to do things. Salaries, not salaries. This is a shirt. This is my philosophy. For those of you who follow me on Facebook know this. Right? I have to practice what I preach as an indigenous educator, as an indigenous person. And this was my philosophy of critiquing the current economic model that strives for the replication of Western capitalist projects, and taking it more to a fundamental level of gardening projects where we're sustaining our own livelihood, our own nutrition, our own diets in a very sustainable way. And I made this shirt as just a joke because I wanted to wear it out on the land. And so I made a shirt, and a few people wanted to buy it, so I added to it. I made a print on teespring.com, and I think I sold 20. There's 20 shirts out there. I don't know who has them. I have 2. But they're out there somewhere. Right? And there's a to-do list, right? Salaries, not salaries. Take land back, right? Plant a garden, feed the people. Very simple philosophy, right, that we're all capable of practicing. On the prairie landscape, we'll pull up to a railway crossing. And a lot of us do this as indigenous people. And we'll see the train start going by, and we're like, oh, damn it, I'm late, right? And you're mad, white-knuckling it, and you're just getting mad at the train going by. And this frustration at this train for our delay in time is really interesting to me, because I was guilty of that. And when my tiredness and my blankness driving back to the city one Sunday night, waiting for the train in Balliford, I noticed that all those train carts were full of grain. And I connected the dot. I said, where is this grain coming from? It's coming from indigenous lands. Right? Why is it that the gross national product of the prairie is grain? Why is it our indigenous lands feed all of Canada and the world, but we're still starving on our landscape? Right? Why is it when we drive 3-4 hours north of here, we'll see clear cutting, and all that lumber is being exported across Canada to the United States and around the world, but the people whose lands those belong to, whose hunting lands those are, the indigenous people, why is it they are still houseless? This is colonialism in play. This is colonization. As indigenous people, this is what we need to become aware of and push back against. These are the projects here. And I practice what I preach. This is my produce from last fall, right? And I like the little emoji that says, because life. And that's the reason why land-based work's important. Decolonial, decolonization work's important. Is because life. Right? That this garden sustained me, it sustained my uncle and my auntie's family for a short while. I plant soup gardens where the goal is to plant the vegetables that make a pot of soup. Right? There's philosophy behind that, because as indigenous people, we're soup people. Right? There's always a pot of soup somewhere. Right? So the soup garden is the framework that I practice in my personal life. That the little green renegades coming up, they're also going to plant soup gardens that's going to feed and nourish their family. At least one pot of soup to come together with land-based nutrients, both philosophically and spiritually and practically. Literally the nutrients from the earth. Right? Again, the prairie landscape. This is my brother-in-law's truck and my brother's truck, where we were harvesting some things we needed in our way of life. And this was an interesting dynamic, because we would always go there and harvest, and we came one day and there's a keep out sign all of a sudden. A lot of berry pickers laughing, I assume, because they know the feeling. And we were parked there one day, and the settler farmer came out and said, what are you guys doing out there? And I said, oh, we're harvesting some stuff. And he was really upset about it for some reason. And it kind of irked me, and to the point where I took this picture, because in this picture, these are our traditional lands and territories. And for some reason, the settler colonial project has maintained this notion that we should not have access to those lands. But under Treaty 6, under peace and diplomacy practiced by indigenous people on the prairie, we have every right to access those lands. So we have to practice what we preach. If you're not comfortable with this conversation, If you need to wrap your head around it, I encourage you to go berry picking on a settler's land, but do it safely, because we know the reality of how settlers are talking here into this province right now. This is colonialism in play. And we have to equip our people to push back against that. And people all around the world are doing it. I've traveled the world. I've traveled in Central America to see it. I've seen indigenous people come together and do amazing things. My closest colleague, my best friend who came with me moose hunting this past fall and was here, Pablo Miss, he's taking the photo. But I spent 2 weeks with them in the jungles of Belize, participating and supporting them and them maintaining their traditional governance system, where those political projects are in play, those economic projects are in play, those social projects are in play. The culture's there, it's maintained, it's just a matter of maintaining the structure, right? Maintaining the discourse. It's amazing, right? Because if they're hungry, they go into the jungle and eat. If they're houseless, they go into the jungle and build a house. That's in play for them. They have access to that, right? This is Pablo's village, Laguna Village, Toledo, Belize. There's a village on the bottom here, right? This is one of the highest points where we were at. And again, that was the jungle. They took me hunting in. We harvested green corn in that jungle. I entered that jungle as a completely different person. And old Mylan's still somewhere roaming that jungle because I came out completely different. Right? I lost probably like 15 pounds because it was so hot. Right? But he's in there somewhere, right? Because it was such a life-transforming experience for me to see and observe this. Me and my brother had the option to visit the Zapatistas for 2 weeks in Chiapas, Mexico. Again, very strict and stern economic political projects in play where they're gaining autonomy, maintaining it, and practicing it. It was literally the only space where in my personal life, I felt what it was to be free as an indigenous person because they did not have to worry about the presence of colonialism in their village. It was a conscious project to be who they are and be where they're from. Right? And again, they're portrayed as scary people by a lot of Western scholars. They're portrayed as scary people by Westerners who fear this conversation, right? And yes, they did sort of come together in certain political economic means, but they're feared in a way where that we should not have these conversations. But we need to have these conversations because I've experienced and observed their children play freely. And I want that for my children, where they were living in their own school systems, their own hospital systems, their own economic systems are in play, their own social structures. Everything was in play, and they decided how it functioned and how it operated. Mexico can't go in there and tell them otherwise. This is a very conscious project that's in play down there. The best way I could explain it is we would drive through the city to get to the next village, and they wouldn't stop. They wouldn't stop at stores, they wouldn't stop at gas stations, because they knew that if they stopped and bought things, it would conflict with their indigenous perceptions. It will conflict with who they are. Right? That's like our people today choosing not to shop at Walmart. That's like our people choosing not to buy groceries from the grocery store. That's how strong and resilient these projects are in play. And so this is the hallmark for me, that these children were free to practice who they are on their landscape, to embody who they are on their landscape. The conscious decision to practice and maintain a better future for our children comes into play when we promote and practice indigenous livelihood frameworks. And again, Zapatista territory. Very mindful with their portrayal in the media. They cover their faces when cameras are present. A lot of people ask, so I'll answer that. Why do they cover their faces? Well, the short reason is they say, well, Mexico didn't care about who we were before, so why do they care about who we are today? Right? Very interesting political project in play here. Right. Again, my brother in the crowd, right, my brother Colby, who came up and put the chair up here for me, he was down there with me. And this was his guardian, the guy who had to guide him and maintain a relationship with him while he was in his village. And I'm really sad because I didn't get a picture of me and my guardian, my bro David. But I got one of Colby and his buddy David there. So Zapatista territory. These projects are in play, and we're capable of embodying them and living them as indigenous people. And where it starts is in the education system and how we're promoting our indigenous children to engage in the world. The remedy to the problems today is education. The remedy to the problems that exist in our relationship with Canada is education. Knowing the truth of who we are, knowing the truth of colonial history, and moving forward in the alternative direction. The direction that disrupts the colonial narrative. Again, Escuelita Zapatista, the Zapatista school. Excellent model for a lot of the young educators in here. If you want to look at alternative education, this is a place to look. Indigenous autonomy and education. How am I for time? 2 minutes.
2 minutes? 3 minutes.
3 minutes? I want to ask my brother to bring up my flip chart here real quick. Because there's a lot of teachers in the room, and I know a lot of you will probably come up to and speak to me and say, well, what do we do? That's awesome. But I'm in the principal doesn't like me. Right? Administrators don't like me. I can't go to the meeting and say this. They'll just fire me. Right? But there's an alternative here. We need to plant seeds as educators. Right? And me as a gardener, taking my gardening project seriously, this is how I do it in my personal life. We need to plant seeds that promote a better future. If I could get the camera guy to zoom in on this, and if you could put it up there. I'll let you guys figure it out. Seed, right? As an educator, my goal in life is to plant seeds that bloom trees of knowledge in the future, right? And this is a decolonization model. This is a model that gives you the tool as an educator to push back against colonialism. The first thing we need to do as indigenous people is we need to stress the colonial system. We need to stress it. And I guarantee you, Canada and a lot of white administrators are nervous because we're getting really good at that. Right? We can mobilize in 24 hours and have 30,000 people across Canada taking the streets. That's the reality of media today. We have that potential and that power. Right? When we're in personal situations with a system that is oppressing me or not open to the alternative, I need to stress it. Right? I need to highlight its problem and say, you know what? Why is it that indigenous students are still failing out of our classes then if we're talking about reconciliation and indigenization? That alone creates a lot of stress for people. They freak out, right? Because now you're highlighting the problem, right? You need to expose the problem. You expose the weakness in the system we're working in. Expose its flaws, right? You need to highlight it and say, look, this is a weak area. We're falling short here. And that alone sometimes creates stress for people who are invested in the colonial system. But expose it anyway. Right? Speak to it. Let people know this is what's going on. This is what's taking place. Right? The next point is when people try to move on and maintain the colonial project, maintain the power, the authority, the authoritarian stance. Exploit. Was my student here? Oh, it's a lower down. You know this. We talked about this. Exploit. When the goal comes for them to say, no, stress it again. Expose it again. And say, you said no already. Right? Exploiting that weakness. Pushing those buttons again and again. Right? I have students who practice this with their racist grandparents at Thanksgiving. And once they realize it, they love it. Right? Because they keep stressing them out. Right? They keep bringing up things at the dinner table, and they ruin Thanksgiving. That's a success for me as an educator. They stress it, they expose it, and they exploit it. Right? They highlight the miseducation. They highlight the misinformation. When we cycle through this again and again and again, frustrations will peak. And there's going to be a moment when they say, well, what do you want us to do then? Right? Some people may have experienced it, laughing. But from the seed strategy, we have already developed an alternative. And the alternative is who we are as indigenous people. The alternative is our autonomy. The alternative is decolonization. And in order to get there, we need to embrace our healthy confrontation skills, stress systems, expose systems, and exploit those systems for a decolonial future. If I'm not stressing systems, if I'm not exposing or exploiting them for a better future, I'm benefiting from colonialism. It's serving me in some way. So as educators, we need to highlight that. Are we benefiting from the colonial education system, or are we striving to develop the alternative education system that restores the humanity in the world? Right, so this is a tool for you. This is coming out of my PhD thesis. I have people in here who said, don't share that until you publish it, because people are going to jack it. But now I'm being recorded, so people know it's mine. Right? But this is yours to use. This is a gift to you from my experience in terms of my educational practice. My education would be useless if it wasn't serving my people. Right? So thank you for your time. I appreciate everything.
Awesome, brother. Stay up here for a minute.
No, paternalism. Hey, bro. I hope.
One more big round of applause for Mr. Mylan Tootoosis, ladies and gentlemen.